White cop lies about black woman in court. He smirked, standing in court, convinced he'd already won. His lies about a black woman flowed easily. After all, who would believe her over him? But what he didn't know, the woman sitting across from him wasn't just anybody. She was a high-ranking Navy SEAL, and when she stood up to speak, his nightmare began. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom number 4, casting everyone in the same harsh, unforgiving glow. Lieutenant Commander Maya Wilson sat at the defense table, her back military straight despite her civilian clothes. Her attorney shuffled papers nervously beside her, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Across the aisle, Officer James Reeves took the stand, his uniform pressed to perfection, badge catching the light each time he shifted. His fingers tapped a confident rhythm on his knee as he was sworn in. The charges against Maya, resisting arrest and assaulting an officer, hung in the air like an accusation against her entire identity. "Officer Reeves, please describe the events of April 17th, the prosecutor prompted. Reeves leaned forward, his voice carrying the practiced certainty of someone used to being believed without question. "I pulled over the defendant for running a stop sign on Oakwood Drive. When I approached the vehicle, she immediately became confrontational, refusing to provide identification." His eyes flicked toward Maya. "When I explained the reason for the stop, she became aggressive, eventually shoving me when I approached her window." Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The rain-slicked evening replayed in her mind, the sudden flash of blue lights behind her car, the officer approaching with his hand already resting on his holster, no explanation offered before he demanded her license, with a tone that assumed guilt. The immediate change in his demeanor when he registered her face through the window. How quickly, ma'am, had transformed into "you people." The judge, an older white man who'd served this county for 20 years, nodded slightly at Officer Reeves's testimony. Maya felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. How many other black citizens had sat where she now sat, their words discounted before they were even spoken? The statistics on racial profiling in traffic stops ran through her mind like mission intelligence she'd studied before deployment. What Officer Reeves didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that Maya Wilson had spent 15 years in special operations, becoming one of the few black women to reach her rank in naval special warfare. She had faced down threats far more intimidating than him. The same tactical awareness that had kept her team alive in hostile territory had documented every second of their interaction, including the dashcam footage that had mysteriously malfunctioned, according to the police report. "The defense may question the witness," the judge announced, his tone suggesting this was merely a formality. Maya's attorney rose. "I call Lieutenant Commander Maya Wilson to the stand." When she heard her name, Maya stood with the controlled precision that marked her years of military service. Officer Reeves's mouth curled into a slight smirk, the expression of someone who expected another desperate defendant's word against his. But as Maya approached the stand, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. Something in her eyes, the unflinching gaze of someone who had made life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure, made his smile falter. "Please state your name and occupation for the court," the judge said, barely looking up from his notes. "Lieutenant Commander Maya Wilson, United States Navy Special Warfare Command," she responded, her voice calm, but carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. Officer Reeves' expression froze as the implications registered. He hadn't expected someone with Maya's credentials and training, someone whose testimony might actually carry weight beyond her race and gender, someone whose word might actually be believed over his. For the first time since the traffic stop, uncertainty flashed across his face. Maya's testimony proceeded with military precision, each detail systematically dismantling Officer Reeves's account. She described how she immediately provided her military ID, how she maintained a respectful tone despite his escalating aggression, how she kept her hands visible at all times, protocols ingrained through years of high-risk operations where miscommunication meant death. I responded to Officer Reeves's approach using the same situational awareness I've developed through 15 years of service, Maya explained, her voice steady. I recognized the potential for misinterpretation and took every precaution to de-escalate. At no point did I refuse identification or become confrontational. The court listened with a new attentiveness. Her attorney called Captain Rodriguez, Maya's commanding officer, who appeared in full dress uniform. Lieutenant Commander Wilson has demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure throughout her career, Captain Rodriguez testified. Her record is impeccable. She has led teams through situations where split-second decisions determined whether people lived or died. Dr. Elaine Chen, Maya's neighbor, took the stand next. I was watering plants on my porch when I saw the police lights. The officer approached Maya's car with his hand already on his weapon. His body language was hostile from the beginning, before she could have possibly done anything wrong. Despite the mounting evidence, Maya noticed the familiar doubt lingering in some jurors' faces, that ingrained tendency to trust law enforcement over black testimonies. A middle-aged white woman in the second row kept glancing between Maya and Officer Reeves, her expression revealing her internal struggle between the evidence and her own biases. Behind the prosecutor's table sat Police Chief Harrison, watching the proceedings with growing concern. His department couldn't afford another excessive force scandal, especially one involving a decorated military officer. Officer Reeves sensed his superior's discomfort and the support beginning to crumble beneath him. During cross-examination, Reeves suddenly introduced a new claim. What I didn't mention earlier was that the defendant reached under her seat at one point, which caused me to fear for my safety. That's why I escalated my approach. Maya's hands tightened slightly, the only visible sign of her anger. This was a familiar tactic, retroactively creating justification for escalation. She'd studied these patterns both as a victim and as an analyst of conflict situations worldwide. Even with her extensive training in emotional control, the humiliation of being criminalized for existing in her own skin cut deep. The trial stretched into its second day. Maya's sister Tanya arrived, bringing a small wooden box containing Maya's service medals and commendations at her attorney's request. During a brief recess, Tanya squeezed Maya's hand. "Mum would be proud," she whispered. Their mother had been a civil rights activist in the 70s, teaching them that fighting systemic racism required both courage and strategy. She always said the uniform wouldn't protect you from everything. "She was right," Maya replied quietly. "But it gives me tools others don't have." When court resumed, a new complication emerged. The prosecutor approached the bench with a printout. "Your Honor, we've discovered the defendant has a prior speeding ticket from 3 years ago, demonstrating a pattern of disregard for traffic laws and law enforcement." Maya's attorney objected immediately. "A single speeding ticket from 3 years ago is hardly a pattern, Your Honor, and would never be introduced as character evidence for a white defendant. The selective application of past minor infractions, something rarely done for white defendants, was a textbook example of the double standards Maya had navigated her entire career. The judge allowed it anyway, and Maya felt another battle line being drawn. Officer Reeves grew increasingly defensive under cross-examination. When pressed on inconsistencies, his language shifted subtly. He repeatedly mentioned Maya's attitude and intimidating presence, revealing the racial bias underlying his actions. "She wasn't like most people during traffic stops," Reeves insisted. "There was something aggressive about her demeanor that made me concerned." Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the coded language. Others nodded in agreement, having internalized the same stereotypes about black aggression. Maya maintained her composure, though inside she battled the familiar exhaustion of being forced to be perfect just to be believed. Her military career had trained her to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission despite personal cost. That training served her now as she watched her character being dismantled through the lens of racial bias. The most unexpected testimony came from Officer Parker, another officer from Reeves's precinct. Called by Maya's attorney, Parker reluctantly confirmed what many in the community already knew. Yes, Parker admitted after several evasive answers, there is an unofficial emphasis on increased patrol presence and stops in predominantly black neighborhoods. It's not written policy, but it's understood. As Parker stepped down, Maya caught Officer Reeves glancing nervously toward Chief Harrison. The foundation of their case was beginning to crack, revealing the systemic problems beneath one individual traffic stop. The courtroom fell silent as Maya's attorney approached the bench with a folder marked Internal Affairs. Your Honor, we've obtained records through FOIA requests showing Officer Reeves has disabled his body camera during multiple previous arrests of black civilians, a pattern documented in internal reviews, but never addressed by department leadership. Chief Harrison's face darkened. This information wasn't supposed to be accessible. The judge reviewed the documents, his earlier deference to the officer visibly wavering. I'll allow this evidence, he said finally. Officer Reeves shifted in his seat, the confidence in his posture crumbling. For the first time he looked genuinely concerned as the pattern of his behavior became visible to everyone in the courtroom. Maya took the stand again, this time not just as a defendant, but as an expert witness. The attorney established her credentials: advanced training in threat assessment, hundreds of hours studying human behavior under stress, experience evaluating genuine versus perceived threats in combat zones. Lieutenant Commander Wilson, based on your specialized training, can you evaluate Officer Reeves's claim that he feared for his safety during your encounter? Maya spoke with the measured clarity of someone who had briefed admirals before high-stakes operations. In 15 years of combat operations across 3 continents, I've learned to recognize genuine threat responses versus manufactured ones, she explained. Officer Reeves displayed none of the physiological indicators of someone actually in fear. His pupils weren't dilated, his breathing remained regular, he maintained casual posture, and his voice never elevated in pitch, all inconsistent with actual fear response. She continued, connecting her individual experience to broader patterns. What occurred that night wasn't about my actions, but about perception. I was assessed as a threat not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. The courtroom remained utterly still. Even those who had been skeptical were listening now. My training taught me to evaluate actual threats based on behavior, not appearance. Officer Reeves did the opposite. He decided I was dangerous before I had taken any action at all. Officer Reeves suddenly stood up. That's not true. You don't understand what officers face every day on the streets. The outburst hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of claiming a special operations veteran didn't understand danger. The judge called for order, but the damage to Reeves's credibility was done. Officer Reeves, Maya continued calmly, I've conducted operations in environments where the threat level was classified as imminent. I've made split-second decisions with confirmed hostile forces present. I understand threat assessment better than most people in this room. The prosecutor tried to recover, questioning Maya's memory of the event, suggesting stress might have clouded her perception. Maya's response was measured. Sir, I've maintained situational awareness while under direct fire. A traffic stop, even an unnecessarily hostile one, doesn't approach that level of stress. Then came the moment that changed everything. Maya's attorney approached the bench again. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence. Lieutenant Commander Wilson, as part of her security protocols, maintains a legal dashboard camera in her vehicle. We have the complete footage of the encounter. Officer Reeves's face drained of color. The police department had never checked for this possibility, assuming Maya was just another defenseless civilian without the means or foresight to protect herself. The judge ordered the courtroom prepared for video evidence. As the footage began to play, the systematic dismantling of Officer Reeves's testimony was complete. The video showed his immediate aggression, his hand on his weapon, before any interaction, the escalation that occurred without provocation. Most damning was the moment Maya clearly placed her military ID on the dashboard and calmly announced her service status. Information Officer Reeves had deliberately omitted from his report. Chief Harrison quietly exited the courtroom as the judge watched the footage, his earlier deference to the officer's testimony visibly crumbling. The protection typically afforded to police testimony broke down in the face of irrefutable evidence. When the lights came back on, the atmosphere had transformed. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. In light of this evidence, I'm dismissing all charges against Lieutenant Commander Wilson. Officer Reeves, you will remain after court is adjourned. There are matters that require discussion. Yet even in this moment of vindication, Maya felt no triumph. Only the weight of knowing how differently this would have ended without her rank, resources, and training. How many others faced similar situations without her advantages? As the courtroom began to clear, she caught Officer Reeves staring at her, his expression a complex mixture of shame and lingering resentment. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, unable to maintain contact with the person whose humanity he had so easily dismissed. The system hadn't changed. Only the outcome for one person, in one case, had been different. And Maya knew that wasn't enough. The case was dismissed, but victory felt hollow. Maya stood on the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun warm against her face after days under fluorescent lights. Her attorney accepted congratulations from colleagues, but Maya's attention was elsewhere, fixed on a small group of black women watching her from across the street. Their expressions held both admiration and unspoken questions. What about those without cameras, without prestigious careers, without the resources to fight back? One woman stepped forward as Maya approached. I'm Deandra Johnson. My son Marcus is serving 5 years for supposedly assaulting an officer during a traffic stop. Same officer, same tactics, different outcome. Maya extended her hand. I'm sorry about your son. Don't be sorry, Deandra replied. Your case might help us. We're part of a community accountability group documenting police misconduct. If someone with your credentials face this, imagine what happens to kids like my Marcus. The women introduced themselves one by one. Educators, healthcare workers, administrative assistants, ordinary citizens fighting an extraordinary battle. Maya recognized the intersection of race and power at work, how her military status gave her credibility, while Deandra's son was automatically criminalized. We meet Thursdays at the community center, Deandra said. We could use someone who understands both sides of the system. Maya nodded. I'll be there. Over the following weeks, Maya used her limited leave time to join their efforts. Her military background provided insight into accountability systems that could be implemented in police departments. The same structures that maintained discipline in combat zones could address the unchecked power in civilian law enforcement. When Maya testified before the city council, her uniform and credentials gave weight to demands the advocacy group had been making for years. Council members who had dismissed Deandra now listened attentively to Maya, a harsh reminder of whose voices society deemed worthy of attention. The issue isn't individual officers, Maya explained to the council. It's systemic incentives that reward certain behaviors and protect others from consequences. In the military, we have rigorous accountability precisely because we hold power over life and death. Civilian law enforcement should be held to no lesser standard. Officer Reeves faced an internal investigation, but Maya harbored no illusions about the outcome. Instead, she focused on structural reforms, civilian oversight boards, mandatory body cameras that officers couldn't disable, and community-based alternatives to armed response for non-violent situations. 3 months after the trial, Maya received deployment orders. Before leaving, she met with Marcus Johnson's attorney, providing expert testimony about police procedure that strengthened his appeal. "Your case created a precedent," the attorney explained. "Not legally binding, but it's changing the conversation. Judges are looking more carefully at officer testimony now." On her final evening before deployment, Maya sat with Tanya on their mother's porch, the same porch where they'd listened to their mother's stories of marching with Dr. King. "I thought winning in court would feel better," Maya admitted, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in warm orange light. "But the same system that believed me because of my uniform still doesn't believe people who look like us without one." Tanya nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "So what are you going to do about it?" "What Mom taught us," Maya answered. "Fight the battles in front of me while planning for the war ahead. Use whatever advantages I have to hold the door open for others." She paused. "The military taught me that no one succeeds alone. We advance as a unit or not at all." 6 months later, Maya returned from deployment to find changes, small but significant. Marcus Johnson's conviction was under review. 2 other cases against Officer Reeves had been reopened. The department had implemented new body camera protocols after repeated community pressure. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was movement. The system hadn't transformed overnight, but cracks had formed in its foundation. Maya understood better than most that real change came not from single victories, but from sustained pressure on multiple fronts. At the Naval Training Facility, where she now instructed new recruits, Maya deliberately included scenarios that taught them to recognize bias in threat assessment. During one exercise, she watched a young black female recruit excel at the simulations. "Lieutenant Davis has potential," a colleague remarked. "She does," Maya agreed, watching the young woman help another recruit adjust their technique. "But she'll face battles I can't prepare her for." Later, Maya approached Lieutenant Davis. "The training's designed to make you better at your job," she explained, "but some lessons serve you both in and out of uniform." Davis nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. "The hardest part isn't the physical training or the technical skills," Maya continued. "It's remembering that you serve a country still learning to see all its citizens equally. And sometimes, being excellent isn't enough. You have to be strategic too." As they walked across the training grounds, Maya considered how many battles this young woman would have to fight, both in uniform and out of it. The path ahead was long, but no longer solitary. Each person who pushed back against injustice created space for others to follow, forming a chain stretching back to her mother's generation and forward to futures yet unimagined. The question remained, hanging in the air like a challenge. What would it take for those battles to finally become unnecessary? How many more Maya Wilsons and Deandra Johnsons would need to stand up before the system itself transformed? The answer wasn't simple, but Maya had learned that the most important missions rarely were. Progress came not from waiting for perfect justice, but from fighting for better justice today than yesterday, and teaching others to continue the fight tomorrow.